This video provides general guidance related to hazardous materials issues potentially affecting transportation enhancement and locally administered projects that are administered by local governments, sponsors, and grant recipients. It is intended to provide locality staff, sponsoring agencies, grant recipients, legal counselors, and applicants involved in these projects a general understanding of hazardous material management during project development and construction. The term hazardous materials, or hazmat, will be used broadly in this presentation to describe petroleum, asbestos, lead, and other substances requiring special management. The relationship between the various types of hazardous materials and how to address them on projects will be presented in 6 different sections. Section 1 covers projects requiring no right-of-way acquisition. Section 2 covers projects requiring acquisition of right-of-way. Section 3 covers structure rehabilitations or demolitions. Section 4 covers consultant selection considerations. Section 5 describes the Due Diligence Certification Form, or EQ 121. And Section 6 is a short wrap-up. You can navigate to each section by using the chapter button on your controller or viewer. This section discusses projects where no right-of-way will be acquired, such as streetscaping, construction of sidewalks, pedestrian and bike paths, the installation of traffic signals, and the posting of signs. Every project, regardless of size, requires some level of review for hazardous materials prior to construction. Most projects of this nature require minimal hazmat review or special considerations beyond proper management and disposal of project wastes. However, projects located near a potential source of contamination, such as a gas station, may require sampling and testing. Section 2 provides guidance in conducting this type of detailed hazmat review. If no contamination is identified during project review, but the contractor encounters obvious contamination during construction, the appropriate action might be to require him to stop work and call an environmental consultant to conduct tests. Certain contaminated materials discovered on utility projects may be used as backfill and kept on site. This option can provide significant cost savings. You should coordinate with the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality before pursuing this option. In addition, be aware that contamination may need to be reported to the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality and/or the EPA. Ask a qualified environmental consultant for assistance. It is important for localities and their sponsors to recognize potentially hazardous materials and gauge project risk in terms of project cost and construction worker safety. Even projects involving no right-of-way or property acquisition can potentially warrant the employment of an environmental consultant. This section discusses projects where right-of-way will be acquired. Examples include bicycle trails, exercise paths, or highway widening projects. Localities and sponsors should recognize that acquisition of property usually involves assuming any existing environmental liabilities. Such liabilities can easily exceed the cost of the project and can require long-term mitigation efforts. To avoid such liability, it is important to perform environmental due diligence prior to property acquisition. Environmental due diligence is the process for evaluating and identifying environmental conditions and assessing potential liabilities associated with a property. It is highly recommended that the locality or sponsor employ a qualified environmental consultant to perform environmental due diligence. One means to accomplish this is to follow the standards of practice developed by the EPA or the American Society for Testing in Materials, or ASTM. Your consultant should be familiar with these standards. Projects involving excavation or grading require more review than smaller projects and may require a historical review of the past use of the property. If the property was used for commercial or industrial purposes in the past, it is advisable to contract with an environmental consultant to conduct an environmental site assessment. Environmental site assessments are usually performed in phases. The first phase, known as a Phase 1 environmental site assessment, typically involves review of the historical and environmental elements of the property. The second phase, or Phase 2 environmental site assessment, typically involves soil and/or groundwater sampling and testing. Testing should be appropriate to the type of contamination anticipated. For example, contamination from a gas station would require testing for petroleum components. Residential properties with no historical use as commercial or industrial property may not necessarily require as rigorous an assessment as the ASTM standards prescribe. The locality or sponsor should discuss streamlined assessment approaches for these properties with their consultants. If contamination is discovered during the assessment process, it is important to determine if the risks exceed the benefits of acquiring the property. Consider discussing the risk of acquiring contaminated property with legal counsel and the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. If you decide not to acquire contaminated property and are not willing to accept the potential risks, there are steps you can take to avoid the contamination. For example, you can change the project alignment away from the offending property. If avoidance is not possible, steps should be taken to minimize the risk, such as acquiring surface easement and/or changing the project design to eliminate or reduce the amount of soil or groundwater impacted during excavation. For example, soil and/or groundwater are removed to construct a typical drilled shaft bridge pier foundation. On this project, the soil and groundwater were contaminated, so a spread footer, supported by H-pilings, was designed to eliminate the need to disturb or manage the contamination. Where contamination is unavoidable, the locality or sponsor must decide if it is more effective to deal with the contamination before construction begins, or assign the contamination management activities to the construction contractor. Contamination management activities performed during construction can be managed through special contract provisions. If the property being considered contains petroleum storage tanks, localities and sponsors should be aware that these require special considerations. Certain activities to address contamination associated with underground petroleum storage tanks may be eligible for reimbursement from the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality's Virginia Petroleum Storage Tank Fund. Localities and sponsors should discuss this with the DEQ well in advance of performing any such activities on eligible sites. In summary, appropriate environmental due diligence should always be exercised prior to property acquisition. Localities should weigh the risks and explore avoidance and minimization options. Managing contamination should only be a last option. This due care strategy will minimize project costs, risk of worker exposure, and potential project delays. This section discusses requirements associated with hazardous materials generally encountered during rehabilitation or demolition of structures. Old structures, such as train stations, lighthouses, and bridges, often contain hazardous materials or pollutants, such as asbestos, lead-based paint, and above or underground storage tanks. These materials must be properly identified and managed to ensure adequate health and human safety. Asbestos was widely used because of its extreme tensile strength and resistance to high temperatures. It is found in building materials such as acoustic and thermal insulation and floor tiles. Asbestos has even been found in bridge materials. Asbestos-containing materials can pose significant health risks to construction workers, building occupants, and nearby residents when improperly managed. Inspection, removal, and disposal of asbestos is regulated by several federal and state agencies. Localities and sponsors should be aware that any structures to be rehabilitated or demolished must be inspected for asbestos by a licensed asbestos inspector. A licensed inspector will report any asbestos-containing material found in the structure and classify the material as friable or non-friable. Some non-friable asbestos-containing materials, such as floor tiles, do not necessarily need to be removed if it is not likely to become friable during demolition or rehabilitation. When managed in place, this approach can offer potential savings. All other asbestos-containing materials are required by federal and state regulations to be removed prior to demolition. For rehabilitations, these materials should be removed if they will be impacted during the project. Drilling, sanding, grinding, or other abrasive activities can cause non-friable asbestos-containing materials to become friable. If non-friable asbestos-containing materials become friable during the project, then all proper asbestos notifications must be made to the EPA and the Virginia Department of Labor and Industry. When required, removal or abatement of asbestos-containing materials must be performed prior to demolition or rehabilitation by a licensed asbestos abatement firm under the review of a licensed asbestos project monitor. On any project, it is against Virginia state law for the asbestos abatement contractor to work for the same company or be financially affiliated in any way with the project designer, asbestos inspector, asbestos project monitor, or laboratory performing the asbestos analysis. Demolition and asbestos abatement require separate advance notification to the Virginia Department of Labor and Industry and to the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Demolition projects require a 10 working day advance notification to the EPA and the Virginia Department of Labor and Industry, regardless of whether asbestos-containing materials are present. If regulated asbestos is present and must be removed or abated, an asbestos abatement notification must be sent to two separate agencies, one to the Virginia Department of Labor and Industry, at least 20 days before work begins, and the other to the EPA, at least 10 working days before work begins. These abatement notifications are in addition to the 10-day demolition notification. To avoid confusion and missed deadlines, the locality or sponsor should decide who will be responsible for making these notifications. No asbestos abatement notification is required for projects containing non-friable asbestos roofing, flooring, or siding materials which, when enclosed, encapsulated, or removed, do not become friable. Records of asbestos-containing waste removed or disposed from the project should be maintained according to federal and state regulations. Lead is another hazardous material that may be encountered when rehabilitating buildings and bridge structures. It was commonly used in paint before 1978. Similar to asbestos, lead can pose significant health risks to construction workers, building occupants, and nearby residents when improperly managed. However, unlike asbestos, there are currently no licensure requirements for workers removing lead. Although there are few regulatory controls, lead-based paint removal can involve significant liability, and if not handled properly, it can result in contamination of the environment. Localities and sponsors should hire consultants qualified to perform lead-based paint removal and are familiar with the evolving regulatory requirements. Lead-based paint on buildings scheduled for rehabilitation may be encapsulated or encased prior to rehabilitation if surfaces are stable. Localities and sponsors should discuss these options with a qualified lead consultant. If encasement or encapsulation is not an option, then lead-based paint-coated materials, such as trim or shutters, along with dust and debris, should be removed and segregated from the waste stream prior to rehabilitation. There should be no sanding, grinding, or sandblasting of lead-based paint surfaces without the use of adequate containment measures, such as in an enclosure or vacuum-assisted power tools and personal protective equipment. Waste generated from lead-based paint removal will likely require management and disposal as hazardous waste. All hazardous waste disposal records should be kept for at least 3 years. Lead-based paint removal from large bridges is a significant cost of rehabilitation since removal may require construction of a containment, the use of specialty equipment, and disposal of large amounts of waste. A good reference for management and control of lead-based paint removal from large bridge rehabilitations can be found in sections 411 and 413 of VDOT's Road and Bridge specifications. Many structure rehabilitation projects may require the removal and disposal of heating oil or other petroleum tanks. Consider contacting the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality if petroleum tanks are present. The DEQ has certain requirements for closure of these tanks. For example, owners are required to report contamination if encountered during closure. Other hazardous materials that may be found in structures include PCBs contained in light ballasts, Freon from HVAC units, and universal wastes such as fluorescent tubes and mercury-containing thermostats. Federal and state agencies have specific storage and disposal requirements for hazardous materials that must be followed. Localities and sponsors should work with consultants who are familiar with these regulations. This section highlights considerations for selecting environmental consultants to provide the services discussed in sections 1 through 3. Localities and sponsors should be aware that there are many consultants who offer a broad range of services. Because many firms subcontract the work out to other firms, the cost may be higher than contracting directly with specialists. Request examples and review the consultant's project portfolio to learn how and with whom the consultant completed the work. Use the examples also to determine the consultant's level of project experience in Virginia. Ask specific questions to determine which work will be subcontracted and which staff will be working on the project. Ask for references to ensure the consultant knows how to do the work. Contact each reference and inquire about the type of work performed and their satisfaction with the quality and cost of the job. Typically, hazardous materials investigations and remediation should be performed by staff-level scientists and engineers under the direction of a senior-level project scientist or engineer. Principal company officers should be charging very few, if any, hours to the project. Make sure that the selected consultant is adequately insured and that the insurance contains liability coverage with no environmental exclusions. The Due Diligence Certification Form, or EQ 121, is required by VDOT to be completed on most locally administered projects. Completion of the form certifies that due diligence activities have been performed on all existing right-of-ways, including VDOT right-of-ways, properties to be acquired, and locally owned, proffered, or donated properties. The form also certifies that due care has been taken or will be taken during construction. The form should be completed when all hazardous materials-related issues have been identified and addressed. Some hazardous materials issues cannot be resolved until right-of-way is acquired. However, a plan for addressing these issues should be developed prior to submission of the EQ 121. Completed forms should be submitted to the VDOT project coordinator prior to acquiring right-of-way. Failure to perform due diligence and exert due care will result in the municipality or sponsor assuming all resultant costs and responsibilities for any discovered contamination. For further information regarding the EQ 121, please refer to the Locally Administered Projects Manual published by the Local Assistance Division found on VDOT's website. Identifying and understanding potential hazmat issues is prudent to ensure the project schedule and budget are maintained. Review the history of property usage, perform environmental site analyses, and work with experienced environmental and legal professionals to minimize cost overruns, delays, and liability. If hazmat issues are discovered, develop appropriate provisions to manage the contamination. The safety of construction workers and the public is of utmost importance and must be protected. For further information, contact the Virginia Department of Transportation's Environmental Division Hazardous Materials Section at 804-786-2480.